Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's Ag Forecast brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. I'd like to begin by doing a little bit of comparison with some of the recent precipitation data we've had. And I love these maps made at Iowa State here that show us precipitation ranks by climate district. So we're going to look at two different time periods. The first is going to be June 1st through June 18th, and that's what you see right here. And what we had noticed is that we had expanded considerably the area that we were worried about in drought, coming out of the northern plains, getting into much of the western Cornbelt, the central plains, and then really into the central Cornbelt as well. Meanwhile, to the south, it was extremely wet. We've talked a lot about the flooding that happened down here in Arkansas, Mississippi, and then how that pushed over to parts of the East Coast. So what I want to do is I want to show you the updated map. We're going to start June 1st and go now to yesterday, and this is what the difference looks like. So let's look at that kind of back and forth. Here's what it looked like before, and here's what it looks like now. So a couple of very important things to note. While the heaviest rainfall was in through this corridor as of late, we did bring in moisture to southern Iowa, eastern Iowa, parts of southern Wisconsin, but there were a lot of holes that were left back here in parts of the western Corn Belt. And I'm going to show you those very, very carefully in just a few moments here. We've also seen that parts of Montana and Idaho have gotten much drier over that time period as we extend out here over the last 10 days or so. Another way to examine this is by looking at soil moisture. And so we're going to go back to the 18th, look at the top 40 centimeters. Again, this map shows you top 16 inches, and so this is percentile. And then we can see the effect of the rain that came through in the last 7 days, and that's what the difference is. Now you do notice, if I just go back and forth, this was on June 18th, this is now on June 28th. There's still a substantial part of the upper Midwest, getting into Iowa, of course into Minnesota, here that things are still very, very dry, whereas the soils are very saturated into this area after all the heavy rainfall that we did get over the weekend. Take note of some of the drier pockets in the northeast as well, and we didn't expect to see changes here, but some of the evaporation rates in the Pacific Northwest, which I'll talk about in a few moments, are continuing to extract what little moisture there is left in that soil. So from there, this is what the total accumulated rainfall was through midnight this morning over the last 7 days. And there are numerous pockets from Texas to Michigan where we picked up in excess of 6 inches, and some places in here more than that, specifically coming into these parts of Missouri, out of Kansas, a couple of places in Illinois, and then into lower Michigan where rainfall totals were between 6 and 12 inches. But what I want to do with this particular graphic here is I'd then like to show you the same thing, but I want to remove everything that's below an inch. So this is now what it looks like if you get rid of all the locations that were less than an inch. And now some of the really drier stretches start to show up, like right in through here, coming out of Arkansas into Tennessee, right over in this part, just on this side of the Appalachian Mountains. And then there's a hole here. And if you draw that line, which I had kind of focused on last week, you get to the north and west of that line, outside of a couple of pockets where there was some heavier rainfall. The last week's rain were very disappointing in these areas. And that frontal boundary, as we worried about, slid further to the south and east, and that's where the heaviest rainfall did occur. So from here, what I want to do is just to continue to assess the situation, I'd like to do something we did, I think it was last week. I'm going to go back to some NDVI imagery. Now, you can do this on your own. It's a fantastic website. It's worldview.earthdata.nasa.gov. When you get there, you have options of adding layers where you can select NDVI imagery and you can choose the time. But what I'm going to do here is you can kind of see we got a whole U.S. view. And when you look at these color bar, remember that these colors represent very healthy vegetation from space, and this represents not so healthy. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare a year ago to this year. Now, not to focus in on one spot, but I am going to focus in on parts of the Corn Belt right in through the midsection of the United States. And what we're looking at first here, this is current. So this is panel A is 2021, end of June 2021. As I slide this across, we'll see a year ago. And there are remarkable differences in parts of the Corn Belt from, again, this is 2020 through June, end of June, and this is now where we currently stand. And so when we look at this, we just have to, step back and analyze the situation to try to understand what these differences mean. But it is not shaping up to look like last year at all across many places. And that's what I wanted to focus on by showing you these data. Now, what's coming in the near term? We're going to start in the tropics. This would be a satellite image that was right here almost at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday. If I pull this back a little bit, we can continue to see the same pattern we have been seeing. Right in through the middle here is where our main frontal boundary still sits. There is higher pressure building in on the backside, and there's still a big high spinning out over here in the Atlantic. And that's why this boundary isn't moving too quickly. But what we did see was the formation of tropical depression. It's right here, tropical depression number 4. And you can see that the main convective plumes from this, there it is, it just updated, they are certainly west of the center of circulation. And if I rock back and forth, you can see that difference. Now this is moving into South Carolina and Georgia. Max sustained winds are 35 knots right now. But this is just going to locally put down some heavier rainfall. You can start to see the scattered storms that are firing all here in the midsection of the country. But one very good thing is, outside of just a couple of larger fires in the west, we do not have the smoke spreading in the west like we did have. Now, speaking of the tropics, okay, there's tropical depression number 4. Look, you can see max sustained wind 30 knots, 35 miles an hour. We don't expect it to strengthen beyond that. But there's another system that right now the National Hurricane Center is giving a 40% chance of development as it moves toward the Lesser Antilles, so right in through this area over the next 5 days, possibly getting over the island of Hispaniola. When we look at the model forecast for this, what we notice here is that once it gets over through the Lesser Antilles into the Greater Antilles here, where it goes is still largely up in the air at this point, and the model spread is large and consistent among all the models that it could possibly get turned around the high, or the remnants could make it into the Gulf. So this is just something that I want to keep a very close eye on as we move forward with this forecast. In the near term, though, let's kind of zoom in here, look at the 12Z NAM model, and you'll notice that this is what is left of tropical depression number 4. So if you just focus over here first, you'll see that that circulation comes on, and there's going to be some scattered storms in parts of Georgia, South Carolina. Some of these could put down 1, 2, 3 inches of rain. But outside of that, by this evening, when you pull in this much Gulf moisture, scattered storms are just the name of the game. And picking out exactly where they'll be and forecasting them, even with our best models, we won't be able to do it. They have known biases. For example, the NAM loves to just turn everything into big, long squall lines. Even sometimes they look like derechos as they move through. And the HRRR has some trouble with convective initiation. But at least we know that the atmosphere is juiced up and there's quite a bit more storms coming through. We see then by tomorrow afternoon where that frontal boundary will continue to sit here. And it's going to be some heavy rain from that area all the way back over to parts of the Four Corners states. Some locally heavy rain, especially coming into New Mexico and Texas. As we play this on through, change is happening by the time we get to the middle of the week. And that change is going to start by breaking down this monstrous ridge. It's currently sitting, almost looks like it's sitting right on top of Spokane, Washington. And the size of this ridge has done a lot to really push the jet stream pretty far to the north here. Downstream trough, there's a ridge sitting just off of the northeast, and that's why it's hot in the northeast. And it's these winds guiding Tropical Depression 4 here inland. But it'll be on this boundary here that we're feeding quite a bit of moisture. What we're going to watch is for this ridge to flatten out, shifting positions, and start to spread both east and west. I'll show you what I mean in just a few moments here. But just to take a look at all of this, that ridge right now is going to peak right around 6 standard deviations above the mean before the pattern begins to moderate as we enter the first full week of the month of June. The graphic I'm drawing on here shows you what's called the Pacific North American pattern. And when there is a big spike upward, that represents a big ridge along the west coast. And then as it dips down like this, like you see once here and again down there, that would mean we're getting some sort of troughing out of the Gulf of Alaska into the Pacific Northwest. So this is where we're going with this pattern. I'm going to come back to that in just a few moments. First, though, I would like to show you some precip maps. So let's just take in what the next week is going to hold. Now, I decided to record this before the 12Z model runs came out because I do not anticipate much change in this. They've been quite consistent lately. But this is looking at the next week's worth of precipitation compared to normal from the European. One thing to point out is that as that front slides to the south and east, it leaves a large area behind it with high pressure that will be building in, and the heat from the Pacific Northwest spreading in this direction. But if you get to the south and east of that line, we're going to start to see quite a bit of heavy precip, and this is all fed on a lot of Gulf moisture. We end up leaving a lingering frontal boundary like this that's kind of serves as the initiation for the storms in New Mexico and Texas as well. And this has been a place that it was dry up before this most recent frontal passage. Now, what's the GFS say? So again, this would be the Euro, this is the GFS. You almost see a very similar pattern. I mean, they both even pick up on the risk of being a little drier in Arkansas. The GFS more aggressive with that. but the GFS is wetter in a lot of places. And I'd like to show you that by comparing the two models. So you notice that through southern Illinois, through the Ohio River Valley, also through the Great Lakes states into the northeast. Remember, these colors on this map represent where the GFS is wetter. This isn't an anomaly map anymore, and this is where the European is wetter. So the European's wetter farther to the south, and then in pockets over in, well, Cotton Belt here in the Panhandles, and then getting into parts of New Mexico. So given that we see similar behavior in the model's forecasts, but different amounts, let's just use one model run to see where this is all going. So let's get this through this afternoon and then into the overnight hours. So what you saw down here, that was tropical depression number 4. This is the frontal boundary we're watching by tomorrow morning on Tuesday. And then what you see is just this same pattern kind of on wash, rinse, repeat. I just took you all the way out to Thursday morning. What is it? There's a high over here, and it's feeding moisture into a boundary that is finally moving. By Thursday morning, higher atmospheric pressure is building into this area, and therefore getting into Thursday afternoon and evening. Now getting into Friday morning, afternoon, and evening. The high sits over Wisconsin. That's going to show up in a change in temperature I'll show you in a few moments, and the front gets pushed farther to the south. So this is now where it starts to bring in much needed moisture into pockets of the Tennessee Valley, and then a lot of excess rain in some locations along the mid-Atlantic getting back through the south over into the southeast. So watch as I keep playing this forward into Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon and evening. High pressure in control in the midsection of the country for July the 3rd. And this is your July the 4th morning forecast on Sunday, midday, and then getting into the afternoon and evening. So by Sunday evening, 7 p.m., we're going to watch that frontal boundary sitting here being the initiation point for our storms getting back here into parts of the high plains. But it seems to be things are looking high and dry into this area. Beginning into next week, the pattern continues to stay looking something quite similar. I just took you all the way out to next Tuesday evening. But there is something very persistent with this pattern, and that is I have yet to see something fully shut down the Gulf of Mexico. Keep that in mind as I go forward here. Okay, so stitch it all together. This is what the European model is putting together for the next 7 days of total accumulated precipitation. And just take note of this color right in through here. That would be our 2-inch color. So you can see that the operational run is really trying to bring in quite a bit of moisture when you just get, let's try that again. When you get south and east of that line, all right? But maybe a better way to analyze this would be to go with the probability tools that we get with the European ensemble. So I'm going to show you a few of them. This is the probability. So you can see here's the color bar at the bottom. That's 70 to 100% there. The probability of getting an inch of rainfall through the next 10 days. Now this map shows us the probability of getting at least 2 inches of rainfall through the next 10 days. And if we take one more look at this, I'd like to go back and let's look at who's going to be very, very dry out of this. So how about total precipitation less than 1/10 of an inch? Now this goes through the next 10 days, and we can continue to see how very hot and then very dry the west is going to be, including into the Canadian Prairie and also parts of the northern plains. So again, this map, probability of getting less than 1/10 of an inch through the next 10 days. That gets us all the way out to July the 8th. Now from there, let's go take a look at what the pattern's going to give us. So I mentioned, watch this ridge. So here's the ridge today, bringing in the heat again. This is the ridge over the northeast, keeping the heat there, and the cooler weather sliding in on this trough. That trough sticks around through Tuesday into Wednesday and is really still centered somewhere in this vicinity by the time we get to Thursday. But as I said, look at how this ridge begins to spread itself out. And we're going to watch an interesting dynamic between that Aleutian low and this ridge in the Gulf of Alaska. Because by the time we get into Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, see how they're pivoting around one another? The whole of the jet stream is pretty far to the north. There's cooler weather over the southeast as a result of this pattern. But then they switch positions. Did you see that? This is by July the 7th. This is when we go into that negative P&A pattern. What has changed, though, is that the net position of the jet stream is relatively far to the north. And as I even let this go all the way out, let's just get it out to day 12 or something like that. You see, the jet stream is trying to put a ridge feature in here, but the flow is coming around and running up over the top. Now, what I want to pay attention to is the fact that we do get right in through here, northwest flow. And northwest flow in summer, at this point in summer, can oftentimes lead to quite a bit of thunderstorm activity. I'll show you that in a second. But if I took you down to the surface, you would see that that high pressure cell is still there and it's feeding into this. And that's why when we go out that far and we look at the pattern in the European model, that ridge is still there. The flow's coming over like this, and there's northwest flow in through this corridor, while there's a high pumping in the moisture. So the net effect is this. Storms streaking across this area. That's what northwest flow gets you. Then you have the surface flow of moisture coming in, and this whole area is showing up wet, wetter than average as we get out there into week 2. From this point forward, let's now go look at temperatures, because so far the month of June has been exceptionally hot west and in the northern part of the United States. And the question is, do we expect to see this pattern continue? Because right now we are still smashing records here in the Pacific Northwest. Now we're sliding through last week. We're up to the 24th here. Every time a dot shows up, these are the colors that represent record highs. Look out for those X's though. Here they come on the 27th and again on the 28th. Those are new all-time high temperature records for cities in the Pacific Northwest. And it did get to 112 degrees over the weekend in Portland, Oregon. And what's interesting is there was a guy, his name's Brian Brettschneider, great follow on Twitter, Climatologist49, right up there, okay? And what he did was he went back through the GHCN data, which some of these weather stations have centuries of data in, more than a century of data in them. And he found every location that has had at one point in its history a high temperature greater than what Portland experienced over the weekend. And so you can see a great map, Brian, of the dots in the Central Plains and the Southern Plains, Southwest, and California. That's pretty much it where we see those numbers. Now, I was just checking temperatures. In fact, let's get the latest update here. This is through 2 p.m. We are already at 105 in the Willamette Valley, 102 in the Columbia Basin. And downstream of that, it's going to get chilly in through this area for this time of year. So highly amplified pattern, and this is the net effect of that. We've got excessive heat warnings, heat advisories, and it covers everything from parts of Montana and Idaho, Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada. This is a large area where we're dealing with excessive heat. There's also heat advisories in the Northeast and flood watches and warnings tucked in between. That's the pattern we're in. So take a look at these temperatures. Highs today, 108, 112, Willamette Valley versus Yakima right here in the Columbia Basin. Look at the cool air that's tucked in on this side. So as we go forward, there's Tuesday's temperatures compared to normal, getting into Wednesday. Now by Wednesday, we start to see some moderation in that ridge, and the heat spreads across the northern tier of the United States and into the Canadian Prairie. Meanwhile, Southern Plains, getting into the Four Corner states, it's crazy to say this, but in Phoenix, 101 degrees on July the 1st is technically about 5 degrees cooler than normal. And you see the cooler weather that's down here. So going on to Friday, into Saturday and Sunday, this is the high temperatures on the 4th of July. So the heat is building across the northern tier of the U.S. and Canadian Prairie, but cool compared to normal across much of the rest of the United States. So we expect this week to have very high evaporation rates that will begin here where we're over 4 inches and then spread here across parts of Montana into this area, which we now know is expected to be quite dry in the near term. Central Valley, California sees those rates 2.5 to 3 inches as well. Same thing with the Snake River Valley. From there, though, let's go over and take a look at what the day 5 through 10 temperature pattern looks like. And now you see the effect of that ridge broadening out like we discussed with the cooler than normal weather to its south. So this is what that pattern gets us as that ridge breaks out and spreads. From there, though, let's get now out into day 10 through 15. This is when we started to see that negative P&A pattern, but with the jet stream so far to the north, this whole area is expected to see above average temperatures. And normally with a negative P&A, we could get cooler weather into the Pacific Northwest, but not with this setup. The jet stream was too far perturbed to the north. So that takes us out in both precipitation and temperature all the way out through the next 15 days. Let's stretch this out and see what else we've got to look at. European model. Let's just walk through. I tell you what, let's go from the newest run here out to, I'm going to go all the way out to the middle of August. How about that? That's the end of the run. This is the 9th of August. So the 10th of July to the 9th of August. There's one consistent factor, and that is this. That high is in place. It's not over Nashville. It's not over Atlanta. I mean, it's out here. And that is why we keep funneling in that moisture. There's a second part to this, and that would be the result of what the precip does. And because of that, it continues to push in that moisture. Now, will the model be consistent? Get this right. It will storm in through this area. And if we continue to put heat and a ridge out in the west, it will be dry in the Canadian Prairie, in the northern plains. But somewhere right in through here will be the cutoff, where on this side of it, it's going to storm. And we're going to get the newest updates, and I'll include them in my report tomorrow morning so you can see them. But this is the latest outlook here all the way to August the 9th. On the temperature side of things, this is something that I did not do a very good job forecasting, and that is keeping that heat to the west. I don't know if the models have a little hysteresis here or what, but they refuse to break down the much above average temperatures, and we keep seeing this whole area showing up with much above average weather. Now, can I find some teleconnection support in this? Well, first of all, we have seen a drop in momentum in the jet stream, the polar jet stream in the northern hemisphere. We've been talking about this, right? Since May, here we are now, almost at the end of June. And that drop is critical because if it continues to drop, the atmosphere will favor a blocking pattern. It'll favor a weaker flow pattern. And if it does that, we will not see the stuff like we saw this past week. We will get much more sporadic thunderstorm activity. So let's go have a look at the forecast behavior of the MJO. It's one of our only subseasonal weather forecasting variables that often shows statistically strong enough correlation to give us any sort of hint at the pattern. So what we're looking at here is the European model's extended forecast. It's attempting to pull the MJO out of phase 1 and 2, which is over by Africa, through phase 3, which is in the Indian Ocean, and then eventually here into phases 4, 5, and possibly 6. Now, just as a reminder, what that means is phase 1 is here, phase 5 and 6 are there, and phase 8 is way over here. We're just looking for where these big storms are. So basically, we're going to see the eastward progression of the MJO right here in these directions. And you can see that by looking here at the ensemble forecast. So phase 1, the green-blue color here is rising motion, and you can see that by the 3rd week of July, it's forecast to move over into this area. Much of that time period will see subsidence in the Pacific Ocean as it does its shifting around. Now, if it does make this transition, what does that possibly mean for us once we get into, past the 1st and 2nd week of July? Well, we saw what the models suggested, but I'll say this again. Phase 5 in July gives us that triple ridge setup, 1, 2, and 3, which means we need to watch out for the MJO to get stuck in phase 5. Phase 6 tends to shift the ridge back over the west, though, and gives us that northwest flow in through this area. So we're going to have to watch that out very, very carefully for the transition of the MJO and its potential impact. What I would say is, if momentum continues to fall, again, if momentum continues to fall, this is the pattern I'm most worried about. Okay? From there, I would like to have a quick discussion about ocean temperatures because they have been changing as of late. We've seen a lot of warm water move up into the Gulf of Alaska lately, pushing in here into the west coast. Now, there's still cool water that stretches into this area. In fact, go look at it right here with me. See, there's still some cool water in there. But we've seen a lot of heat building here toward Washington. And what does that do? That favors later in the summer for the ridge to be farther back to the west. That would be through July into August. So we're going to have to watch out for that carefully. I know when we look at this, we start to see that there is some warm water here, and there's questions about what kind of pattern we're going to have in the Pacific Ocean later this year. Well, later this year, I do expect this to stay warm, which means tropical systems will have a lot to feed on. But there is no, really warm water that's continuing to feed. In fact, let's get this animating here. That's continuing to feed up to the ocean surface. And what I mean by that is, if we were going to go into an El Nino midsummer and then fall, we would expect to see a lot of hot water still in place coming up into these areas. What happened is we now have replaced the warmer water earlier. See the warmer water right there? It's now being replaced with some cooler water. We may go back into kind of a double dip with a weak La Nina later this year. I'm going to watch that carefully, and I'll keep reporting that back to you, all right? Appreciate your attention today. We'll talk to you again very soon. Thanks.